Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate everyone that is here today. And I have a very special guest today. Trolley Dave is here with me.
Hello, thank you for having me on.
Trolley, I'm going to start by letting you, do you prefer to be called Trolley or Dave?
Just call me Dave. Trolley
Okay.
Dave is an old nickname for when I used to be a trolley collector.
Okay. So, Dave, this is your first time on my show, and I know that you are new to some people who are here. So, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
I'm Dave. I'm one of the Answers and Reason crew on YouTube, and we mostly discuss philosophy. We discuss films and stuff like that as well, but like the philosophy of the film. Um, I've been studying philosophy for a while, as you can see from the background. And I just love having these kind of discussions. So when you said you wanted to have this kind of discussion, I was like, let's have it.
Wonderful. So you said you are on a couple of other podcasts. Tell us a little bit about what channels they are on. I did put a link to your YouTube channel in the description of the video. But where else can people find you?
Um, on the Answers and Reason YouTube channel, um, that's where I do most of my streaming. The stuff on my channel at the moment is some of the pre-records that I've done. And you can find them on Answers and Reason as well. And we've got a podcast, which we haven't really done for a very long time now that we've moved to streaming, but you can find that on most popular YouTube, not YouTube, like Google Podcasts and stuff like that.
Okay, very good. Now, for my background and to give you an idea of what level you need to be speaking at is I have taken one philosophy class. I took Philosophy 101. And at the time I took the class, I'm guessing that you were probably in diapers. It was 1980.
Okay, I would have been about 9 years old.
9 years old. Okay, so you were in elementary school, and that is the extent of my philosophy study. When I took the class, I was extremely nervous because I was a believer, and the philosophy professor, he was actually a minister, but he was a Unitarian minister. And in my evangelicalism, we viewed Unitarians as one step above unbelievers. And so I was just always nervous that what I was saying wouldn't be accepted, although I really had no reason to feel that way. The professor was an absolutely wonderful person. He was a very accepting person of any viewpoint. But it was a class that I had difficulty learning in because I was so nervous.
Understandable. I was like that for about the first 6 months of my undergrad, to be honest.
Okay. And what are your religious views?
I'm an atheist, and
Okay.
I've always been an atheist. I wasn't brought up religious or anything like that.
Okay. All right. The way that this particular show came about is I got into a couple of different discussions with people where I got backed into a corner because I didn't know the answers. I didn't know how to go, where to go from where I ended up. And this is the setup for the discussion. The discussion was over whether or not objective morality exists. And of course, we went to biblical slavery, and I was arguing, obviously God endorsed biblical slavery, and my opponent was saying that, okay, has slavery always been wrong, even when people didn't know it was wrong? And I'm thinking, yeah, no question, slavery has always been wrong, whether people knew it or not. Does that make it an objective moral value? And that was the question I could not answer, and that is the question that I brought Dave in to answer for us.
Okay, so I mean, it really kind of depends on what you mean, but that kind of statement, you could say you believe it was wrong, but it might not be objectively wrong. It's just that you think it was wrong. But if you're going to say that it's true that it's wrong, then you would be arguing for a kind of objective morality, because what objective morality is the idea that moral statements are true or false. So there's an actual truth to them rather than just a kind of preference or a belief or an emotive response.
Okay. Do you think that there is an objective morality?
I do.
Okay.
In philosophy, it's kind of referred to as moral realism, and it's this idea that there are moral statements that are true or false. And the way it's sort of described is that they're attitude independent, so it doesn't matter what you believe about them, they're either true or false. And a lot of religious people will kind of pin you down and say, well, without God, there is no objective morality, which is false. Because you can ground it in, say, deontology, you can ground it in utilitarianism, and you can say, well, look, I get that you don't accept that these ground them, but I don't accept that God grounds morality, so you're at kind of a stalemate.
Okay. One thing that I was contemplating is, prior to the existence of humans, was slavery still wrong? And I would have to say yes, even though it had never happened yet.
Okay. I mean, you could say yes, in the same way that prior to the existence of humans, 1 + 1 = 2 was still correct. There's no mind to express it, but it's still one of those statements that exists in all places at all times. Like, I can't imagine a universe where 1 + 1 does not equal 2.
Mhm.
So a statement like slavery is wrong, if you're saying it's true even if no humans exist, then you're saying it's just a necessary truth.
Okay. Okay. So what's
Uh,
the difference between a necessary truth and an objective truth?
a necessary truth is a truth that can't fail to obtain. In other words, it must be true.
Okay.
It can't ever not be true in any universe at any time. So even if there exists an alien species in another universe, it would still be true that slavery is wrong. And even if they believe that slavery is correct, it would still be wrong.
Okay. Okay. Let's discuss Danny's comment. Danny says moral realism or moral objective facts are facts about moral oughts that are stance independent.
Yeah, like I say, it's, you want not commit people to slavery and it's attitude independent, except he's used stance independent.
I see. I see. And then Danny followed up by saying a stance being something that pertains to your intentional states, beliefs, desires, goals, etc.
Yeah, so basically saying, like when I said that it's independent of your preferences.
Okay. And Lord Bryant has kind of given you a bit of a challenge here. He says Dave probably will never get to that decision, unfortunately, or give a final stance.
What's he referring to?
Okay, his previous comment was okay, that he is a moral cognitivist, but unfortunately, I am undecided on objective or subjective.
Yeah, I'm guessing what he's saying that is I'll never convince him of one way or the other.
Ah, okay.
He should
Okay.
just listen to me because I'm much smarter than he is.
I see. I see. Okay.
I keep trying to convince him to be atheist, but he sticks to his deist stance.
That's all right. I can tolerate deism. Oh,
Yeah.
he says, no, I'm talking about myself on that one.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what is the source of morality?
For me, it's just the idea that we're rational human beings. You could argue that it evolved along with us in a sort of group cooperative way.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Mm-hmm.
think it goes beyond that as well, because I don't think empathy is quite enough for morality, because morality is supposed to be independent. I'm not entirely convinced of the idea that we don't have special moral obligations to our family and that kind of thing, but it's supposed to be more cosmopolitan in that, we're supposed to have the same moral obligations to somebody in another country than I do to, like, my family, except I owe a little bit more to my family.
I see that, but I tend to view that, of course, having a legal background, I see that from the legal standpoint. Because legally, you do have more of an obligation to your family because you have financial and what's the word? Not fiduciary, but you do have duties to family that you don't have to other people. Particularly, a parent owes support to a child. This is one of the discussions I ended up getting into with somebody earlier today was when I made the comment that, God kills innocent children. The theist that I was arguing with said, "Well, don't parents have an obligation to care for children?" And I said, "Of course they do, but that's a legal obligation. It's not the same as the obligation that a God would have to children." Um, and so I think part of the idea of having a greater moral obligation toward family comes partly from emotion and partly from that legal obligation.
Yeah, I can see that. But I also think that there is slightly more moral obligation as well, because you've brought this
Mhm.
person into this world.
Right.
Bringing the person into this world means that you owe them at least enough to get them going in life,
Mhm. Mhm.
because I'm a value pluralist, but I take to virtue ethics and utilitarianism a bit more. And utilitarianism would say, if you bring this child in and you make them suffer, you're behaving immorally because you should be maximizing the
Mhm.
good,
Mhm.
so to speak.
And the same works true at the other end of the spectrum, that when the parent is aging, the child has the same duty to the parent that is
To
aging
Yeah,
because the parent, took care of them when they were young. Now it's the child's turn to care for the parent. Mhm.
absolutely. Yeah. And again, that would follow from something like virtue ethics or
Mhm.
utilitarianism.
Okay, I've stopped my flow of the chat. So if you've said something recently, I haven't gotten to it because I wanted to get back to this comment from Danny. Moral cognitivism is the position that moral statements can be true or false. Okay.
Yeah, it's that we can actually understand them, and we can think about them, and we can check them and analyze them and see that they are true or false.
Okay.
Sort of like the statement, the background is green on this stream.
And Icarus says, I'm a moral non-cognitivist and don't listen to Dave.
But he also flew too close to the sun and burned his wings off. So, how much can we trust what he knows?
Uh, Okay, and Danny says you can be a moral cognitivist and then either be a realist or anti-realist about moral statements. Okay, very good. I was asked recently about my position and I read briefly and I declared myself a moral anti-realist. However, I don't know that I really was. I'm not sufficiently certain that that is my position. If you, I don't really know enough to be certain that that is my position.
Um, if you believe that it's true that slavery was wrong, that biblical slavery is wrong, and it doesn't matter what time we live in, it's still wrong, you would be asserting a truth, or that this can be true or false. So you would be a moral cognitivist according to that view.
Okay. Okay.
There's also an idea called error theory, where moral statements sound like they have truth values, but they actually don't. We're making the error when we assert, because there's no actual facts in the world that we can map that moral statement to.
Okay. Now, someone who takes that position, how do they deal with suffering? That suffering is a universal wrong.
They would say, I guess you would say that it's not true to say that it's wrong, because that's not quite how it works. We can feel empathy for people that are suffering, but there's no fact of the matter that maps onto the idea that suffering is wrong.
I see. Okay.
You can still have a kind of emotive response, and you can still, oh yeah, Danny's just said, they're all false and not true. Not that they don't have a truth value, but they're all false. But like I say, they don't actually map onto anything.
Okay. Moral error theory thinks that all moral statements do have a truth value. They're all false or not true. Okay. And Lord Bryant, yes, when I made that statement about being a moral anti-realist, I was referring exactly to what you're talking about here. He says, I remember sending you a DM on Twitter and you said the same thing, I believe, because there's a lot of moral positions that are not objective or subjective. And yes, I read over what you said and I made my decision based on what you wrote. However, like I said, I don't think I really know enough to be definitive at this point.
I think one of the best ways to look at something like morality is to kind of start from things that you think, is this wrong? Is it wrong independent of what people believe about it? If it's okay in one culture, is it wrong in another? And then start thinking about the logical entailments that comes from those. And see what you think about those logical entailments. And if you don't agree with those logical entailments, you need to do a little bit more thinking about how you stand on morality.
What if I come to the conclusion that something is morally wrong, but everybody around me disagrees, but I am 100% convinced that they are wrong and I am right?
That's a hard one to work out. Because if you can actually make a good argument, you can make a good argument for why one particular moral theory is correct or why a certain set of values is correct. You could be correct, but this is why an error theorist would say, well, there is no fact of the matter. There is no real moral properties in the world to actually assess that statement against. So it makes it harder to actually argue that that absolutely is the case.
Okay. So it's not a fact situation. But is it merely an opinion then?
You could say it's a reasoned opinion, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, Danny's just said send him a link. He might be able to help.
Okay.
He's at a higher level than I am.
Okay, I will. Danny, do I have you on Twitter? That's where I do most of my. Or here, I'll just put the link in the chat. And Danny, you go ahead and jump in. There we go. Okay. Oh, Ox is here too.
I don't know him.
Hey.
Hello, Danny.
Hey, how
Hi,
are
Danny.
y'all?
Good to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Trolley. I see you all the time. A little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. Oh, I can hear myself. Let me turn the other one. Okay. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy. I'm a grad student and getting my master's in philosophy. Really love philosophy. I'm still a student, though. I mean, it's just like you never stop being a student if you're interested in this stuff. So But yeah, I don't know. Trolley Dave has been doing a decent job trying to get through all the terms, and sometimes the terms are just like you feel like stuck in the mud. But the terms are there to help, right? Because it's hard to like express what
Yes.
you believe, right?
Mhm.
So the terms are there to like get you. Oh, I'm okay. That's what I sympathize with, right? Like that's what they're there for. So sorry, there's a lot of terms.
Now I can make the joke that I was going to make with Dave, but he was just a little bit too old. When I took philosophy, Daddy, you weren't even born yet.
I'm an old man. I just turned 29. So is that? Now I have to. I learned something now that I'm getting older. I know now not to bend with my back, but bend my knees to pick up something. That's how you know you're starting to go. You're over the hill, right? But I don't know. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It's great to have you. So now, Danny, tell us a little bit about yourself as well. Do you do content as also?
Yeah, I as some people know in the chat, I cause mischief on all sorts of channels, but I do have a channel that's more or less mischievous. I have educational videos, debates on philosophical topics. I am an atheist. I have a lot of debates against Christians, and I have some informative videos, short little videos on different philosophical terms and jargon and technical language. It's called Phil Talk. It has a red logo. That's a little bit about me.
It's a great channel. If you're interested in philosophy, go to Danny's channel. It's brilliant.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dave.
Brainbug or Ox or someone who has a wrench, if you have a link to Danny's channel, if you could throw that into the chat, that would be helpful. They'll get that taken care of for us, so I don't have to search for it. So how long have you been doing this, Danny?
Oh, for in terms of YouTube stuff or philosophy stuff?
Both.
Okay, so guess I used to be a young Earth creationist. Okay,
Oh,
do you know what those
really?
are? Yeah.
Oh, yes.
In middle school, right? I was a young Earth creation in middle school. Loved the Ken Ham. We did a Bible study devotional thing called "Demolishing Strongholds." That's what Ken Ham enabled us thing. And I think young Earth creationism, it's very highly implausible. Okay, yeah, it's scientific garbage. We know that, right? But it got you thinking like a little bit like a philosopher, just a little bit, right? So it's sort of like one thing led to another. I left young Earth creationism. I went to the William Lane Craig theistic evolutionist camp, and then I got into philosophy through Christian apologetics, and then I deconverted in 2020. But yeah, I started as a Christian apologist. Now I just like philosophy. I don't care about Christian apologetics. As academically, I don't study it academically. I study other stuff academically. But I've been doing the YouTube thing for a year.
Okay, very good, very good. I also was at one time a young Earth creationist. I've been all over the map. I quit being a young Earth creationist when I went to the Shed Aquarium. When I saw lungfish, I'd always thought, fish cannot grow lungs and then walk out of the water. And when I went to the Shed Aquarium and I saw lungfish, I went, yeah, they can.
Oh my God.
These fish
Mind
have
blown.
lungs. And so then I was an old Earth creationist.
But y'all are talking about ethics now, right? I love meta ethics, especially. So I did catch the part. You were posing an objection against the Bible. You were saying slavery is morally wrong. God found slavery to be permissive or permissible, morally permissible. So that's like a problem if slavery is wrong, that God doesn't exist if he's all good. And the theist tried to ask you whether you were a moral realist or an objectivist about moral statements, and then you kind of were like, oh, what do I say? Is that kind of like
yes, yeah, because I really didn't know.
Yeah, so I will say most philosophers are moral realists, about 60% of them.
Okay.
There are a smaller percentage, of course, that don't take a position, and then amongst those moral realists, there are lots of kinds, right? But yeah, that's how the landscape is. I'm personally an anti-realist, but I'm somewhat familiar with some of the moral realist positions. But yeah, I don't know where you want to start.
Brainbug asked, was it morally permissible for the Titanic to leave the water?
Yeah, but like if, for instance, like if you thought that you consequential or some kind of form of utilitarianism was true, like we want to maximize the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, minimize pain, whatever, all that, then you can use these normative theories to like, hey, God doesn't conform to this moral theory, so God is out of accord with morality, and then you can. That's typically how some people do it.
That's
But is that kind of where
exactly
you're
the
coming
way I
from?
do it. That's
Okay.
exactly, yeah, that's exactly where I was going.
Yeah. So it is weird. I think you could come at it that way. That's more of like a realist position. Hey, morality is real. Here are the moral facts. God's at accord with them. But then you can also, the anti-realist has some maneuvers here too, I think. So
Okay.
you don't have to be a moral realist to pose this sort of objection, I think. The point is that what a lot of Christian apologists say is that slavery was like somehow necessary or good for society because it accomplished or prevented pain or something like that. For instance, they cite that if you were not allowed to be a slave, you couldn't pay your debts, or
It
Yeah.
was a social insurance system.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's a pretty good objection to that. The point is that if God's all powerful, he could accomplish those aims without slavery. So why he seems like he likes slavery, right? Like if the point is that like I'm going to use the vaccination example, right? We all want to be vaccinated. We all want to be immune to COVID, right? But we're limited creatures. We have to get pricked in the skin. I hate needles, right? Like that's a necessary evil kind of, right? Like I have to get pricked to be immune to COVID, right? But if I were God, I could just get immune without getting pricked, right? I don't need the pricking, right? Like I don't like the pricking. I'm all powerful. It's not necessary, right?
Right.
So God's in that position, right? He can do whatever he can accomplish. He can make it to where people don't need money or can live fruitful lives without depending on society or where there's no war, right? But so he can accomplish all these aims without slavery, but nonetheless, slavery is being used. In fact, what that would mean is that God actually thinks slavery is morally necessary and not like it's like saying like, yeah, I want to get pricked, even though I could have gotten immune from COVID without getting pricked. It just seems kind of absurd. It means I just like getting pricked. Or, God's some kind of like,
A
sadist.
prick.
Yeah, he's a prick. Yeah, he's a sadist, right? So you can go either way. I'm not a moral realist, so I tend to go the way that I went like if you're going to ask the theist, hey, do you think that if you have this goal and you could achieve that goal without slavery, would you do it? And if they say yes, then that means they find disvalue in slavery. Okay. And if they say yes, well, then if God can bring about any logical state of affairs, perfectly logical to say that God can accomplish his aims without slavery, and God didn't do that, then that kind of God doesn't exist. That's the problem. I just gave you from evil, except we use slavery instead of evil.
Okay, very good. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Danny. It's basically kind of like the problem of evil, I guess you could say. In that, if God is this all-powerful being, and we see him doing it in the Bible, as far as I'm aware, raining manna down from heaven to help people who were in trouble, he could do the same for slavery. He could organize the world in such a state of affairs that slavery isn't necessary. But slavery seems to be this very human thing. So that sort of lends idea to that the Bible is written by humans for humans. It's just that they use God as this ground to make it harder to argue against. Well, this is what this all-knowing, all-powerful being wants. If he's all-knowing, then who are you to say that this is wrong? Like, that's a popular objection that I'll hear.
Okay.
Yeah, and the point is that you can go in Godless's Godless Granny. Sorry, I know a person named Godless Girl now. So Godless Granny, Godless Granny. You can say, hey, these are the moral facts. God is out of accord with them, or you can just say, seems like an all-powerful God could accomplish his aims without slavery. So you must think slavery is like good, and then they bite the bullet. So I think either way,
I usually can't get them that far. Usually they devolve into some kind of circular reasoning or they disappear. I'm usually doing most of my arguing on Twitter. One of the reasons why I do a lot of my arguing on Twitter, even though it's kind of a dumpster fire, it does sharpen me. it helps me see where my errors are, like the one that I'm presenting here. Had I not had some of the arguments that I'd had on Twitter, I would not have realized that this was something I needed to finish reasoning through, and I could not reason through it on my own. I needed some help. And it also, I've made a couple of arguments that were really bad arguments. They were awful. And by trying them out on Twitter, where today they're heard and tomorrow they're forgotten, I know better when I go into my produced videos and my streams as to which arguments to make.
Yeah, I can sympathize with that. I mean, I've made really bad arguments before. So it's the in exposing yourself, you know, and like in kind of testing how you think about the world out in the public sphere really has really benefited me. It seems like it's benefited you as well. So
If you want bad arguments, you should read all the first year assignments of my undergrad.
oh yeah, but if y'all want to talk about moral realism versus anti-realism, I didn't know what direction you wanted to go.
Well, I do want to talk about that, but let me hold that thought and don't let me forget about that and pass it, because there's one other thing I wanted to address first. And that is, you know, we were talking about some of the arguments that we get from atheists. And one of the things that I get that I'm not sure about is some will talk about objective morals and some will talk about transcendent morals. And some use those two terms interchangeably. And what are your thoughts about what is the philosophical position on, are those two different terms? What do
Yes.
they mean?
They don't seem like it, but they are. There's a view called moral naturalism, which is the view that moral facts are natural facts. And so that can be a kind of objectivism, right? So the idea is that you might say that morality or evilness is pain or something like that, right? And let's say you construe pain in a natural way. There's a fact of the matter about what's in pain, or, you might naturalize it to other things. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be a mental state. You might think that, evil is like, I don't know. I'm trying to think of, particular examples. I guess like a virtue, like, evil is being disingenuous or something like that. And there you're equating a moral fact with something natural or whatever. Whereas a transcendental, like a non-natural fact, you see the ethical naturalist and the non-naturalist might agree on one thing. They might agree that they're objective moral facts, but they disagree about whether those facts can be reduced to natural things or not. So, so that's kind of, I think there is a difference there.
And what's your opinion? Can they be or can they not be?
Can they be naturalized?
Can they all be naturalized? Yeah. Would you consider yourself a moral naturalist?
I'm not a naturalist.
Okay.
I'm a non-naturalist. But a lot of people are moral naturalists. A lot of people are. So there are smart people on both sides in philosophy ever. Like you can always. So I don't like the idea of people being persuaded just because I take a position. But yeah, I tend towards non-naturalism. I don't really think the good can be reduced. It's sort of like the reason why I think that, just very briefly, is that have you heard of that distinction between prescriptive and descriptive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay.
I make that argument all the time.
Yeah. So this is why I'm a non-naturalist. I think natural things describe our world. So the tree is there, right? Hydrogen has one proton, right? That's descriptive, right? And prescriptive stuff is like shouldness. Like, for instance, if I say that water ought be there, that's a different statement than that water is there. So the former is the prescription, the water ought be there, and the latter is the description. What the moral naturalist does, more or less, and they're different. I mean, it gets complicated, but basically they say, hey, this prescriptive stuff is actually descriptive stuff. Okay. That's what they do. And I think that's crossing a bridge you shouldn't cross. Okay. But there are a lot of people that disagree. They think that, well, no, you can bridge it somehow. I mean, there are non-philosophers that are famous for this. Sam Harris is very famous for trying to bridge this gap between is and ought, prescriptive and descriptive. There's a lot of conversation centered around this, but I lean on the view that there's this hard line between prescriptive and descriptive, and I'm not so keen on crossing it. So that's kind of my idea of it.
I would tend to agree with you, but from a very different perspective. But first, I want to get Dave's perspective. What are your thoughts on the topic?
I lean towards moral non-naturalism as well, because
Okay.
there doesn't seem to be this thing, like if you think about Hume's is-ought distinction, it doesn't seem to be the case that just because something is pleasure doesn't mean that we ought to maximize it. There must be other stuff in between. And I think saying something like stealing is wrong, maybe not in all cases, but, like just a general stealing is wrong, there doesn't seem to be any natural fact or natural property that we can map that onto. That's more of a societal structure kind of thing.
Although
And I think
one thing that's
the
interesting,
is-ought gap is something that's really interesting, and it's kind of hard to overcome, and it's kind of really important within morality itself.
one thing that's interesting is you can see that behavior in animals, and I have looked for but cannot find. There was a clip that Paula Gia played in one of his videos of a man teasing a dog, where he was offering something to a dog and then pulling it away, and another dog came and pushed the man's hand, so he couldn't tease the dog. He had to give the bone or whatever it was to the dog. And it was really an interesting demonstration of how the dog was letting the man know, "This is wrong. Give the bone to the dog." I wish I could find that, because I've often made the argument to theists that, or not to theists, but well, yeah, I guess theist is the correct word, but to evangelicals, that morality is not exclusive to humans, that animals exhibit it as well. And there's a lot of examples of animals exhibiting morality, but this one is just such a perfect example. I wish I could get that clip.
Yeah, I think the concept of shame probably indicates a moral dimension. If you attribute shame to a creature, I think that there's some kind of recognition that there's something wrong going on if they're in shame, and that wrongness, I think, it has to do with it's a kind of moral recognition. So.
Lord Bryant has a comment here that I do not understand. It says natural atheists are based. Love them because of how challenging they are. I'm wondering, does he mean biased rather than based, or do
No,
I?
he means awesome.
Oh, okay.
Basically, yeah.
It gets to also, I wanted to say one more thing about this, has to do with God and ethical naturalism. Some people classify certain divine command theorists as ethical naturalists. And the reason why is, once again, they're saying what you should do is a function of what God wants or what God's nature is. So they'll say, you're doing, theist, you're doing the same thing. You're equating a prescription with a natural nature, a thing that is. So that's interesting, right? You might hear that. So sometimes naturalism or naturalizing doesn't mean the same thing in metaethics or ethics as it does in metaphysics when we're talking. Whereas in naturalism or naturalize in metaphysics, we're talking about what the sciences talk about. Like, if you think naturalism is true, that means everything is in principle understood in terms of the natural sciences. So sometimes moral naturalism or naturalize might mean something different in metaethics. So you want to keep that in the back of your head. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic, Dave, before we move on to another one?
No, that's good. I was going to say, one of the complaints about moral naturalism is the idea that kind of, if something is natural, we can discover it with science, but there doesn't seem to be moral properties that we can discover with science. So moral naturalism doesn't seem to fit the bill. Like, I've heard that argument.
Okay. Okay. I want to return now to the point that you brought up earlier, Danny. What was it again? I can't remember.
So moral realism and anti-realism. Right?
Okay.
do you want me to kind of present maybe how we might think about the difference?
Sure.
Okay. So philosophers, people that study metaethics like to talk about, when they're talking about realism, is either reasons or value properties. Usually one of those two or both. So for instance, when someone says, I should not rape, most philosophers are going to agree that in some sense that might mean that rape has a property that, of this value or value, right? Property. Or they might say what it means to say you should not rape is that you have a reason not to rape. Okay,
Can
I'm sorry.
you say R word instead? Just
I'm
because,
sorry. Yeah.
YouTube doesn't like that word.
I'm in ethics all the time, and we throw out extremes so people are all on the same page, right? So let's just use stealing, okay, just for sake of argument. Okay, my bad.
I say R word all the time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, it's true. I should be sensitive. I'm sorry about that.
No, I mean, I don't use the word. When I want to explain that concept, I say R word in place of it.
Yeah. Okay.
We use unalive instead of the S word.
I see. Okay. That was my bad. I should have been sensitive to the audience. So let's use stealing. So if someone says stealing is wrong, some moral philosophers think that's like some property of stealing. Other ones might say what it means to say stealing is wrong is that we have a reason, or you have a reason not to steal. Okay. Now the interesting part is where that property or reason is, so to speak. Okay. So when I say that I have a reason not to steal, or I have a reason to give to charity, as a moral anti-realist, I'm talking about internal reasons, my beliefs and desires. Okay. So when I say that I have a reason not to steal, I'm expressing a desire or a belief about rape such that it motivates me or explains my refraining from doing it or my acting in doing it. Okay. Now, the moral realist, when they talk about reason, stealing is immoral, they're talking about something different. They're talking about something called an external reason. Okay. So this is a reason outside of my stances, outside of my goals, beliefs, desires, anything in my agency. There are reasons out there. So some very famous philosophers came up with this, or have this view. You have Kant, very famous. This thing called pure reason. It has some kind of relationship with agency, that pure reason is connected to agency, but nonetheless, it's a reason out there. One of the most famous contemporary moral philosophers, Derek Parfit, he just died in 2017. He accepted this notion of external reasons. Okay. So when he would say that you have a reason not to steal, and that's some kind of moral truth, we're talking about reasons out there. Okay. And when the anti-realists usually ask, okay, I know what an internal reason is. I'm talking about my beliefs and desires. There's sort of tethering, right, between my internal reason and my beliefs and desires. So, Mr. Moral Realist, if you're talking about reasons out there, what are you talking about? What is that connected to? And they give a variety of answers. Some people Parfit will just say something like that which counts in favor of. Of course, then the anti-realist is going to ask, what does that mean, right? And so that's kind of like what the dialectic is. Pretty much all the realists understand what internal reasons are, right? That's even realists accept that they're internal reasons, but they're going to say that there's this reason over and above internal reasons, external reasons, and the game is in the whole dialectic, and the whole conversation is what that is if it's not tethered to our agency. Okay. So that's one way that you might see the dialectic is between internal and external reasons.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And before I give Dave a chance to respond, I want to let the chat know something. Normally, I'm listening to my guest and reading the chat at the same time, and I can kind of go back and forth between these. And I mentioned this to Dave before we started the show. I cannot do that today. What Dave and Danny have to say is sufficiently new to me that I have to concentrate completely on what they are saying in order to get it. And I apologize to the chat. I will try to get to your comments, but I'm going to be a little bit late because I can't do both. And normally I do both at the same time. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Danny. For me, like I lean heavily towards virtue ethics, so I think everything is sort of internal anyway, and it's kind of understanding moments. It's kind of like a moral particularism where we can sort of gain better understanding of how we ought to behave from previous experience and from figuring out what might be the right thing to do. I think this is one of the things that a religious person might argue, that if God exists, there are external reasons. And this is what they lean on when they say there is an objective morality. There is a reason out there. There are moral properties within the universe that are over and above our thoughts about them. But I don't think there are actual external reasons. I think it's all kind of internal, and it's all something that's reasoned out.
So it's more of a projecting thing, that it happens internally, but the theist externalizes it, projecting his own internal thoughts onto the universe.
That's like the perfect accusation. I've heard professional philosophers give that exact psychological analysis of what's going on. And it's not just theists, right? It's other moral realists that are non-theists that are sort of doing the same thing. They have strong internal commitments or internal reasons for what's right or wrong. And in that intuition or that conviction, they part of the criticism is that they project, they project these external reasons, and they try to project them onto people. That's one criticism that anti-realists give to realists in terms of what's going on psychologically speaking. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I see that for a different reason. This most of this makes sense to me, but from a slightly different perspective because of my own experiences, which are outside of philosophy. And that is, as a believer, we would pray and we would see answers to prayer. And I would have a journal where I kept track of, these are the things I prayed for and these are the answers. And that's the way I saw it. But when I deconverted and I was no longer a believer, I can go back and look at that exact same journal and realize that there was never any God involved. It was me projecting my God ideas onto what was going on around me.
Yeah, and I actually had similar experiences, especially with respect to morality. I realized that I had really strong convictions and feelings about what I think should happen, and then I was telling people, well, you can't do that, right? Like then you have an external reason not to do that. But yeah, very similar experience.
Okay. And comment from God equals the square root of -1. The idea that human moral systems need to appeal to a supernatural deity, making man this super being, seems typically myopic to me.
I wanted to speak to this because about a couple of days ago, I made an objection to a Christian YouTuber, and my objection had nothing to do. They were being very critical of Islam, and I was just basically saying, "You're just as ridiculous." But to me, it's like people have mud on their faces, and they're all pointing at each other. They have mud on their faces. That's how I look at these situations in many cases. And he got sort of angry with me, and then did the whole "you have no objective morality" or something like that, right? So because God doesn't just God grounds objective moral norms. But I didn't really get into it with him. But I think you can make a claim like this. I think you could say, like, well, no, I think if God exists, I think you could just say that, no, I think if Christianity exists, I think there's subjective moral norms. I don't think that there's any real moral truths, right? Or moral realism. And then they're gonna, well, what about goodness and God and all that stuff? You're just talking about what God wants. Why should I care about what God wants? And then if they try to answer that question without appealing to God, then they're appealing to a standard outside of God. Right? So that's kind of what's going on there, is that I don't think it works. Even if God exists, I think moral realism would still be false. It's not like God is going to help the situation. So in other words, I see the realism versus anti-realism debate totally distinct from the theism versus atheism debate, right? The theist tries to bring that debate into the theism versus atheism debate, and thinks that that will help them. It doesn't. I just think them as totally independent discussions. So I think that's really interesting.
I've heard Vice Rhino make a similar argument with regards to other things that limit God, for example, free will. Some theists make the argument that God can't do something because that would violate someone's free will. And Vice Rhino makes the argument, if God cannot violate someone's free will, who made the rule that God can't do that?
Yeah, they'll say it's logically God is logically limited or something like that. But I personally think that God could set up the world where you freely do the right thing. I mean, I don't see any contradiction there.
Mhm.
So then, yeah, I'm right there with you.
Okay, let's see. Icarus says, "You have no objective morality. I have my invisible friend who gives me objective morality." I should try that argument with a theist. You have your invisible friend, I have my invisible friend. What are we going to do now?
Yeah, right, that's how it is. Yeah. But what we've been talking about is meta ethics. So there's like three branches of ethics. There's meta ethics, which is like the fundamental nature of right and wrong.
Okay.
Normative ethics is something different. It tries to understand why certain actions are right or wrong. What's the secret ingredient, so to speak, right? So Kant, Mill, Hursthouse, Aristotle, all these people have an account of what makes an action wrong. But when they're giving that account, they're not really doing meta ethics. They're not giving you the nature of right or wrong. They're saying, anytime I call this wrong, it causes pain or something like that, right? And so that's kind of the unifying factor. That's my theory for why these sorts of actions are right and these sorts of actions are wrong. So that's called normative ethics. So meta ethics is the nature of right and wrong. What is right and wrong? Normative ethics is what is a secret ingredient that makes it such that these actions or things are right or wrong, good or bad, good and evil, whatever, right? And then you have applied ethics. Of course, there usually you're applying your moral theory to specific moral dilemmas, whether that be political issues or whatever, abortion, gay marriage. Dave. Dave. I know you, and I'm just calling you Trolley. Dave brought up moral particularism and moral generalism. That's a really interesting distinction. Would you like to explain that, Dave, or do you? Because I've been talking too much.
Yeah, no worries. Moral particularism is this idea that we can sort of build our intuitions about how to behave in certain situations, and that we can actually understand what is the right and wrong action in any situation built on previous experience or previous knowledge.
Yeah, without principles.
Without principles, yeah. Whereas moral generalism is the idea that there are moral principles that can guide our actions in situations, and we can derive how we ought to act from these general principles.
Yeah, there's a very famous philosopher named Bernard Williams, and that was actually Derek Parfit's advisor. I mentioned Derek Parfit earlier. Bernard Williams thought that our moral lives were untidy and complicated, and it was a fruitless endeavor to present a theory of it. Like, everyone's in their circumstances, has different psychologies. Life is messy. Why have principles, right? That was Williams's view on ethics. He was a moral particularist. Right and wrong depended on your situation, your life circumstances, your history. There weren't these principles out there guiding you into what you should do in the situation. Rather, the situation itself guides you as to what you should do. So most normative theories actually kind of invoke a principle. Virtue ethics might get away with it because they might be a little bit more sensitive to the situation. Phrases like,
it's more agent-centered than act-centered.
Right, exactly. Stuff like, what would Jesus do, is a very virtue ethicist view. And the idea is that what would Jesus do in that situation, right? Whereas Kant, very famously, lying is wrong no matter what situation. The Nazis come knocking door looking for your Jews. either refrain from saying anything or tell them the truth. Don't lie, right? That was, I mean, people make jokes. You're so Kantian, right? So strict, right? Bernard Williams would have none of it, right? Like, he was like, no, look, obviously the right thing to do there is lie to the Nazis, right? Like, that's what your situation demands. So moral generalism versus moral particularism is basically, can we be, the moral particularist is saying we can be good, we can know right and wrong without principles. The generalist is saying, no, we need moral principles to guide us in our action in terms of knowing right and wrong, or what makes the situation right and wrong is that principle.
Interesting. Interesting. I'm trying to relate that to the whole slavery debate. And
Oh yeah, that's yeah.
yeah, that brings a whole new spin to, when someone asks me, has slavery always been wrong? If this, I may use the term incorrectly, the situationalist, is that the correct
The
term?
particularist,
The
particular,
particularist,
yeah,
okay, would say that no, in their situation, slavery might have been right, whereas in our situation, it would be wrong.
exactly. They could say that. In fact, I did when I was a Christian apologist. But I think the trick is that the reason why in that particular situation, I think slavery might have been permissible is because humans are so limited. They didn't know how to deal with their issues without certain forms of slavery, right? The thing is that God doesn't have that problem, right? He's not forced to use slavery to accomplish his aims, whereas I would. If I was forced into a war and I saw, a family and I couldn't support them financially and they were going to get executed otherwise, I'll take them as slaves, please, right? Like they can just help me out in the backyard and they can live off me and they can do work for me. I would totally do that, but that's only because I'm limited. I'm a limited being, right? Otherwise, they might have gotten whacked by the Israelites or whatever, right? So I think that the reason why I don't think the particularist move works for the Christian apologists is because God is just omnipotent. He doesn't need slavery to accomplish his aims.
Okay, I'm going to go back and check if there's anything that I've missed in the chat that we'd like to highlight or questions that we should answer. Let's see. Hansen says, I feel sometimes then theist claims the objective moral rules exist. It is like claiming that the rules of chess is objective. The rules of chess are made by humans, but they're also written down. Dave, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you can sort of argue that a lot of objective morality is kind of like that. It's basically the system that we draw our judgments from, sort of similar, like breaking the rules of chess. You could also sort of argue that the theist is kind of doing that, because what they're taking, they're using their kind of, I guess you could say, subjective judgment to choose theism as the set of principles to make those decisions from. And if you say, well, we need God, well, we have several different theories coming from what claim to be God. So you're just kind of picking the one that you most relate to or have been brought up in.
Okay. Do you find, Dave, that many people change their philosophy over time?
I have several times. I used to be a complete subjectivist, and then the further on I got in my studies, I sort of started adopting utilitarianism and then went to virtue ethics, and now I'm more of a value pluralist.
Okay. Just in case says doesn't Yahweh translate to the old-fashioned word that just means me? Basically, believe in him because I said so, mistranslated. Okay.
I know very little about the Bible, if I'm honest.
Oh, really? Oh, I know the Bible very well. I have
I've
read.
never been religious, so.
We also have the comment, it seems like what they are saying is objective good or bad. The phrase objective morality is a sloppy term.
I wouldn't say so. I mean, it has a particular meaning. And it means, that there are these judgments that are beyond our attitudes. So I don't think it's a sloppy term.
And
Depending on
to
how you see
clarify saying it,
morality, I
I
guess.
think absolute morality would be more accurate. And I think Icarus in one sense is correct here, because the way that most people that I argue with use the term objective morality, what they really mean is absolute morality.
Yeah, I see that a lot. I don't know about Danny, but I see that a
I
lot
see it a
when they
lot
say,
in YouTube. I'll tell you that philosophers avoid the word absolute because it's vague.
it's
It's
very
a
vague.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because absolute can mean necessarily, or absolute can mean mind
Hmm.
independent. You typically, if that term is used, the philosopher quickly stipulates what exactly means, right?
Okay.
So, but that's not always. I mean, that's not always true. Sometimes philosophers will use that in common parlance, and then the term is meaningless. But it's not a very good technical term. So,
To me, absolutely means without violation. Um it cannot be violated.
yeah. So that means like necessarily then in that case.
Yes,
So
yes.
yeah. Mhm.
And God, I hate saying this name because it's so long. God says absolute morality is complete word salad, Icarus, like saying the square root of a pork chop. Let's see. Okay. Ox obviously is a moral realist. The slavery debate is bullshit. Slavery is wrong no matter when or where. Did I get that
Oh,
right?
you know what is interesting is, and this is a common misconception, you can be a moral realist and not be a moral
I'll be
generalist.
back in 2 minutes. My dog's barking downstairs.
Okay.
So the guy that forwarded moral particularism is actually sympathetic to moral realism. He just thinks that there are real or external reasons for each situation, that there's no overall principle. So you could be an anti-realist or a realist and hold to either particularism or generalism. You might hold a principle for yourself and be a moral anti-realist. You might say, hey, for myself, I ought not do anything that causes other people pain. Okay, that might be a principle unto yourself. But that makes you a moral generalist, but it doesn't make you a realist. So
Okay.
the idea is that you can think that there's moral facts, but be a moral particularist or generalist.
Just in case says objective morality sounds like an oxymoron, like you are either being objective or moral, not both.
Yeah, we have a lot of anti-realists here, it seems like.
Okay. Brian Stevens says way late, but the answer is no. Morality is an idea and only exists as a function of the mind, therefore it is subjective.
There's another anti-realist. Yeah, we have a lot of anti-realists in the house.
Let's see. Almost a Doctor says, I believe that you can have objective morality, but you need the base to be, do you need the base to be subjective?
Okay, this is a good question. I've heard years ago, Cosmic Skeptic said something like this, where he said that out of our subjective imperatives or our own reasons, they're therefore objective oughts. Now, personally, I find that a little unintelligible if you translate, right? The idea is that if I am thirsty, I want something to drink. If I want something to drink, I should go to the fridge and get a cup of water or something like that, right? The thing is that all of those moral prescriptions are understood ultimately in terms of my agency, and that's all I mean by subjective, right? Or not being an anti-realist, right? So it's true that if I'm thirsty or if I want something to drink, I should drink something that doesn't kill me, like water or soda or whatever, right? Even though that's true, it's not objectively true. So I think a lot of people really love to equate objectivity and truth, right? Like if something's true, it's like they get this feel that it's like objective, but not always, right? I think if I should drink water, if and only if I want to drink water, if I am thirsty, right? And I think that's a subjective truth. So I think there it's kind of blurring the lines between objective and subjective. Now, one last thing, there are some people that are constructivist about certain morals. And this is a really clever move. So they would say that there are certain norms or imperatives built into humans. Okay, so that means that it's not objective, but what is it? Universal. Okay, so if you're a human, like here's a good example: rationality, right? You should not contradict yourself. Okay, some people think that that's built into the idea of being a person, of being an agent. Okay, some people don't. But for someone that thinks that that norm is built into us, they're taking a constructivist position. Okay, think of it as like, what to construct an agent, you have to make them care about the truth because they have beliefs that are aims at the truth, right? Something like that. Okay, and so there's a way of saying that, okay, not objective but universal. Okay, so that's an interesting move that they might make.
Okay. We have a question from God. Isn't morality an emergent system of social species? I believe it is. I believe it is.
You want to say something, Dave?
I basically said something similar at the beginning of the stream when I said that it's sort of it's something that will emerge from a species that kind of works together and kind of evolves this trait where working together can help the survival of whatever tribe or species or what have you. But I think morality has become something other than that as well, because it's become this thought about what we ought to do, not just this thing where we are a cooperative species.
And very briefly, I think that the constructivist picture kind of, if something like that is true, I think it's a constructivist picture that maybe evolutionary mechanisms build into us to care about each other or something like that. But that's as far as I would go. But anyways.
Okay, Almost a Doctor says, I think one of the biggest limitations to morality is that we don't have enough information to predict the future with high accuracy. That's a really interesting observation, especially knowing who Almost a Doctor is. He's a PhD student in physics and specifically cosmology. And so he knows well some of the limits of our understanding of the universe. And it's true, we do continue to discover more and more. And I think that is one of the reasons why morals evolve, is because as we come to understand human needs and empathy and the perfect example is spanking. My parents thought spanking was the right thing to do, and all of the information from the psychologists and the experts out there said that this was a good thing. And now we know, no, it's not. It's not helpful. It doesn't do good. And I think he's got a point there, that one of the limitations that on what was considered moral behavior when I was a child, that is now considered almost immoral behavior. I don't know that it's quite gone to that level yet, but it's certainly going in that direction, because we simply didn't have enough information.
I mean, a utilitarian might agree, and that's why they say you shouldn't use the hedonistic calculus to calculate every action before you take it. You should just sort of go off in intuition and make a prediction about what is most likely.
Yeah, I think Dave just hit the nail on the head. The question, although I do care about consequences sometimes I don't, the question presupposes a consequentialism, or the idea is that you're deciding what you should do because it might cause something that you value or disvalue. And so, yeah, if sometimes there's an epistemic barrier, there's a knowledge barrier between what you're faced with deciding at that moment and what it will cause. And then we're just like faced with like a big dilemma, right? Because we don't know what our action is going to do. Certainly, yeah.
Okay, let's see. I'm still trying to catch up with the chat. Brian Stevens says the function of a mind is not anti-realistic, but rather is a reflection of the interpretation of perceived reality, subjective. I don't even understand what that means.
I'm not sure what. I think he's speaking about the fact that there is only phenomenal experience and we're not actually seeing reality as it actually is. I'm not sure.
Okay. Okay. Okay, Almost a Doctor asks, does that mean that morality is independent of any independent mind, but is, like math, a tool for describing reality? I'm not sure what he means by an independent mind. Do you?
Yeah, that would be my question for him. But it seems like the second question clarifies a little bit of where he's going. The essence of the question is there are some philosophers think that stealing is wrong, just like two is true, just like 2 + 2 = 4 is true.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
that they're just affirming a kind of realism, and so I guess maybe y'all could speak to that, or we did discuss that quite at length though.
I'm a little behind on the chat. I'm still trying to catch up. Yeah.
You usually have such an active, you usually have an active chat, right? Yeah.
I do. As I was explaining, I normally can listen to my guest and read the chat at the same time and pick out which comments, but with you, I can't do that. I have to concentrate on every word because
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, it just means I'm learning. Usually my guests are telling me something that I already half know, and I only have to half listen to catch the other half. But you're telling me things that I know so little about that I have to concentrate on every word. Let's see. If morality was independent of mind, it would be observable as such. Dave, any thoughts on that?
I mean, it is kind of observable because we can see, like your example with the dog, we can sort of see that kind of happening in the real world. There's plenty of things we can see that aren't independent of a mind going on in the world, I guess.
Okay. Ox, I want to let you know that I'm not ignoring you. I just feel like we've kind of already addressed the slavery, whether or not that's an absolute standard or so forth. And I don't think we can really get anything more from the discussion out of that. But you're welcome to continue discussing it in the chat. But I'm not going to bring those questions up because I think we've already pretty much covered all of that. One last comment from Brian Stevens. I will rephrase as a question. Can you perceive reality without interpreting the information from senses? That's a good question.
I would say no, because we are a phenomenological species.
I would just say that could be, we could talk about that all night. So
it's a big question, yeah.
If put in a state of total sensory deprivation, humans will still continue to experience sensation, but it's memory sensation. So it's still perceived as if it were from the five senses, even though it's actually coming from within the mind.
I feel like it's more a question about something like the noumenal and the phenomenological. Sorry, I'm getting tired, so my words are starting to get a bit...
Yeah.
Or like representationalism or something like that.
And for those of you who don't know, I do have to apologize. We have kept Dave up extremely late. Dave is in the UK, and it's, 2 o'clock in the morning there?
Yeah, just gone 2:15. And I'm an old man, so...
And we'll be wrapping up pretty soon. Danny, are you in the US?
I'm in Louisiana, so.
Oh, okay. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. And is the information from the senses objective enough for interpretations to be equal? I don't know. Dave, would you like to briefly explain what you just mentioned a minute ago?
The phenomenological and the pneumological.
Yes.
Noumenal. Yeah, it's basically we see everything through our senses and we interpret the sense data as it comes in, and we don't actually see the world as it is. We don't see a world of atoms and empty spaces. We see shapes and colors, and we see a representation of the world rather than the world as it actually is, to put it as simply as possible.
Okay. Kind of like the gosh, I can't even think of the name now. The movie with Keanu Reeves.
The Matrix, right?
Thank you. Matrix.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
Some scientific revelation last week that kind of talked about something similar, that we're not actually seeing the world as it is. We're seeing the world as it's represented to us.
Okay. Kind of the brains in a vat question.
Not
really?
quite so much, no, because that's being fed. That's experiences being fed to us from a machine rather than.
Oh, okay. I never understood that way, but then again, I don't usually. Somebody will ask me that question briefly, and then they're gone. So I've never really gone down that road very far.
I kind of love that question just because I'm a pothead and I enjoy talking about things like that.
Okay. Would you like to expand on it anymore? Or did you already say everything you wanted to on that point?
No, that's pretty much it. It's just this idea that what I suppose you could say it's kind of like Descartes' evil demon, where what if all what you're seeing isn't actually real? It's just all stuff being fed to you from a computer or from an evil demon, and all your senses are being fooled. I mean, if you're a brain in a vat, you don't really have senses, I guess. But you're just being fed information. Whereas, if this is the real world and, we exist in a real world, then we're actually seeing an external reality.
Okay. And what is the philosophical end to that line of thought, that if none of this is real, then what?
It's an argument. It's a skeptical argument about knowledge and how can we ground knowledge, and, can we ever actually know anything?
Okay. That was actually all of what I wanted to cover for the stream today. Is there anything else, Dave, that you would like to add?
Go watch Danny's channel. He's brilliant.
Danny, is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to discuss these issues.
And I'm extremely grateful for you jumping into the stream. I think you had a great deal to add to the discussion, and I think it really helped in shaping the discussion as well. And so I was very glad to have you, and I definitely want to have you on another time. Have you on once again for another chat. So with that, I'm going to let each of you once again mention your channels and what you do, because some of the people who are here now are not necessarily the same people who were here at the beginning of the show. And then we'll go ahead and wrap things up. So Dave, go ahead and tell everyone where to find you and what it is that you do.
You can find me mostly on the Answers in Reason channel. We usually do a stream on a Tuesday and a Thursday. We take it sort of serious and like to have a bit of a laugh while we do the stream. And we cover all different kinds of topics within philosophy, but we try to make it for a general audience.
Okay, very good. And Danny?
Yeah, just very briefly. I have a channel called Phil Talk. You can Google or YouTube it. It's with the red logo. I have some of my debates. A lot of them with against theists, mostly Christians. And I also have informative videos on some technical language used in philosophy. I think my last informative video was about Kant and his view on free will. So if you're into that kind of thing, then you should check it out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This week video that I have coming up is a little bit different, but not all that much. It's still anti-theism as usual, but picking on a particular pastor who has found himself in a bit of trouble this week. And next week's stream, my guest will be Godless Engineer, and we will be talking about mythicism. Mythicism is not a position that I hold, but I do find it an interesting position. So, Godless Engineer next week to learn about mythicism. Thank you, everyone in the chat. You've added so much with your comments and your questions. It's been fun having all of you, and thank you so much, Dave and Danny, for this discussion and for this enlightening experience for me to learn a little bit more about philosophy.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Live your life.